This sounds like a hallucination, but it is a strictly documented historical fact. A single man walked into a boiling, hostile war zone carrying nothing but a small, empty wooden box. Within a matter of minutes, he completely stripped the strongest, most terrifying tribal warrior of his physical strength, leaving him weeping and trembling on the floor, unable to lift a piece of wood. Shortly after that, he stood completely still in front of a furious man with a loaded pistol, smiled warmly, and caught a live, speeding bullet directly between his teeth. He didn't fire a single weapon. He didn't command a single soldier. He didn't negotiate a single political treaty. Yet, he completely crushed a massive, bloody rebellion that a heavily armed empire had failed to stop. He was not a brilliant general. He was not an elite assassin. He was a quiet, polite clockmaker from Paris. And he conquered an entire nation by convincing them he was a god. To understand how a polite man in a tailored evening suit managed to stop a war with parlor tricks, you have to understand the absolute desperation of the situation. The year was 1856. The French Empire was occupying Algeria, and they were losing control. But they weren't losing to enemy generals or sophisticated armies. They were losing to mystics. Local spiritual leaders, known as the marabouts, were quietly traveling from village to village, preaching a massive, violent revolution. But they weren't just giving inspiring speeches to gather troops. They were performing miracles. To prove that they were chosen by divine forces, the marabouts would stand in the center of a village and chew crushed glass until it turned to dust, never bleeding a single drop. They would walk barefoot across blazing hot coals. They would let highly venomous snakes bite them on the arms and face, walking away completely unharmed. The local tribes watched these impossible feats and came to a very logical conclusion. These men are immortal. Their cause is protected by higher powers. If we follow them into battle, we cannot be killed. The French military commanders were completely paralyzed by this. It was a nightmare scenario. You can send infantry to fight infantry. You can fire heavy artillery at a stone fortress. But how do you shoot a myth? How do you kill an ideology? The generals realized that logic, brute force, and traditional warfare were completely useless. If the local population genuinely believed their leaders possessed literal magic, they would fight to the very last man, happily throwing themselves at French bayonets. A conventional war would be an absolute bloodbath for both sides. The French government realized they needed a completely different type of weapon. To fight a war of illusions, you don't need a general. You need a better wizard. This is where the clockmaker enters the story. His name was Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin. If that name sounds vaguely familiar, it is because decades later, a young American escape artist would be so obsessed with him that he would steal his name, calling himself Harry Houdini. But the original Houdin was nothing like the frantic, death-defying escape artists of the future. Robert Houdin was an intellectual. He started his career as a master horologist, a man who built impossibly complex clocks and mechanical singing birds. He spent his days hunched over tiny gears, springs, and cogs, understanding how to hide immense mechanical complexity behind a simple, elegant exterior. And eventually, he realized that human perception works exactly like a clock. You can manipulate what people see, as long as you keep the gears hidden. Before Robert Houdin, magicians were mostly loud street jugglers, wearing ridiculous costumes with fake moons and stars, performing cheap tricks for pennies. Robert Houdin completely changed the game. He put on a tailored black tuxedo, rented an elegant theater in Paris, and transformed magic into a high society intellectual puzzle. He wasn't doing tricks. He was temporarily suspending the laws of physics. When the French government came knocking on his door, Robert Houdin was actually retired. He was living a quiet life, enjoying his wealth, probably fixing old pocket watches in his study. The military officials pleaded with him. They told him about the glass-eating marabouts, the snake bites, the impending war. They essentially asked a retired theater performer to travel to a desert war zone and prove that his magic was stronger than the magic of the rebellion. It sounds like the plot of a surreal movie, but Robert Houdin packed his bags, loaded a few mysterious wooden crates onto a ship, and sailed to North Africa. Imagine the scene when he arrived. The Algerian heat was blinding. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The French military had gathered all the most influential tribal chieftains and marabout leaders into one grand theater. These were hardened, fierce men, warriors who respected strength, blood, and divine power. They expected the French to parade their cannons, to march thousands of soldiers in a display of violent intimidation. Instead, the curtain rose, and out walked a frail, pale, incredibly polite European man in a formal dark suit. He bowed deeply to the hostile crowd. You can almost imagine the chieftains rolling their eyes. But Robert Houdin knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't start with grand explosions. He started by slowly bending their perception of reality. He pulled endless objects out of empty hats. He made heavy objects float. He manipulated time and space on the stage. The chieftains were intrigued, but they weren't convinced. Sleight of hand is one thing. Divine power is another. Then Robert Houdin brought out a small, incredibly simple wooden box. It had a metal handle on the top. No locks, no chains, no hidden compartments. He placed it carefully on the wooden floor of the stage. He looked out into the crowd of hostile warriors and announced that he possessed a power greater than any weapon. He claimed he could drain the physical strength of any man in the room with a single word, making them weaker than a small child. He invited the largest, most muscular chieftain to the stage. A giant of a man, covered in the scars of battle, stepped up, glaring intensely at the frail Parisian. Robert Houdin asked the giant to lift the wooden box. The chieftain smirked, grabbed the metal handle, and effortlessly lifted the box into the air, laughing. Robert Houdin smiled politely. He waved his hand over the box, closed his eyes, and muttered a single dramatic word. He then looked the giant in the eyes and said, "Now, you are weaker than a woman. Try to lift it again." The chieftain laughed, reached down, and grabbed the handle. He pulled. Nothing happened. The box stayed completely glued to the floor. The warrior frowned. He planted his feet wide, his muscles coiling like thick ropes under his skin, his face turning red with exertion. He pulled with the kind of primal force that could tear a heavy wooden door right off its iron hinges. The box did not move a single millimeter. It was as if the small wooden cube had suddenly become the heaviest object on planet Earth. The crowd fell into a dead silence. They were watching their strongest warrior entirely defeated by a piece of wood. But Robert Houdin wasn't finished. He didn't just want to embarrass the man, he needed to completely break the myth of the rebellion. As the chieftain was desperately yanking on the handle, sweating profusely, Robert Houdin gave a subtle, invisible signal to someone waiting off stage. Suddenly, the muscular chieftain shrieked. It wasn't a grunt of frustration, it was a pure, high-pitched scream of absolute agony and unimaginable terror. The giant dropped to his knees, his hands trembling violently, staring at the wooden box as if it were a demon. He scrambled to his feet, turned away from the polite clockmaker, and sprinted entirely out of the theater as fast as his legs could carry him, screaming into the desert night. The remaining chieftains sat frozen in their chairs, their eyes wide with sheer panic. The Parisian had just stolen a man's life force without even touching him. How was this scientifically possible? You have to remember, this was the mid-1800s. To understand the trick, we have to look under the floorboards of the stage. Before the chieftains even arrived, Robert Houdin had completely reconstructed the theater. Directly underneath the spot where the wooden box sat, he had installed a massive, heavy iron block wrapped in miles of copper wire. It was an electromagnet. Today, electromagnets are in everything from our smartphones to our cars. But in 1856, electricity was a wild, mystical concept to the general public in Europe, let alone to tribal leaders in the Algerian desert. The wooden box had an iron plate hidden perfectly in its base. When the chieftain lifted it the first time, the magnet was off. When Robert Houdin said his magic word, his assistant backstage simply pulled a switch, sending an electrical current from a primitive battery into the copper coil. The box was instantly magnetically locked to the floor with hundreds of pounds of invisible force. And the terrible scream? That was the brilliant, ruthless touch of a master psychologist. When the chieftain was struggling, the assistant flipped a second switch. An induction coil sent a sharp, painful electric shock directly through the metal handle of the box into the chieftain's hands. To a man who had never experienced electricity in his entire life, it genuinely felt like his soul was being ripped from his body by an invisible, demonic fire. The audience was terrified, but the tension was not over. The marabouts, the spiritual leaders who started the rebellion, were losing their grip on the crowd, and they knew it. One angry marabout, desperate to save his reputation, stood up, pulled out a heavy pistol, and pointed it at Robert Houdin. He shouted that the box was just a cheap trick, an illusion. He demanded a trial by blood. If the Frenchman was truly a wizard with divine protection, he could not be killed by a bullet. This was the moment of absolute truth. One wrong move, and the war would start immediately, right there in the theater. Robert Houdin stood completely calm. He didn't flinch. He looked down the barrel of the gun and accepted the challenge. But, showing an incredible understanding of human psychology, he told the angry mystic that his magic was tired. He said a spell of invulnerability requires deep meditation. He demanded that the execution be delayed until 8 o'clock the very next morning. Why delay? Because fear is a marathon, not a sprint. By forcing them to wait an entire night, Robert Houdin let the anticipation and anxiety completely consume the rebels. They spent the entire night wondering if the Frenchman was insane, suicidal, or truly immortal. The next morning, the air was entirely still. A massive crowd gathered in the courtyard. Robert Houdin arrived looking as elegant and unbothered as ever. He walked over to a stone wall and stood against it, offering himself as a completely open target. The furious marabout stepped forward. To prove there was no trickery, Robert Houdin handed the man a lead bullet and asked him to mark it with his own knife. The marabout carved a deep mark into the metal. He then loaded the gunpowder himself. He pushed the marked bullet into the barrel of his own pistol himself. He raised the gun, aiming it dead center at the polite clockmaker's heart. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. Nobody breathed. The marabout pulled the trigger. A deafening crack echoed against the stone walls. A thick cloud of black gunpowder smoke engulfed the stage. For a second, the French officials held their breath, terrified they had just gotten their best performer assassinated. But as the smoke slowly cleared, the silhouette of Robert Houdin remained standing. He hadn't fallen. He hadn't flinched. He simply smiled, reached up to his mouth, and spat a heavy piece of metal into his hand. He walked slowly over to the terrified marabout and handed him the bullet. The man looked down at his shaking hands. It was the exact same bullet. The deep knife mark was right there. The clockmaker had caught a speeding bullet with his teeth. The rebellion crumbled instantly. The marabouts dropped to their knees, bowing their heads in total submission. They believed they had just witnessed the power of a supreme being. The secret of the bullet catch was just as elegant as the heavy box, and completely dependent on human psychology. The bullet Robert Houdin handed to the marabout to mark was real. But the moment the marabout handed it back to be inspected, Robert Houdin used flawless sleight of hand to swap it for a perfect replica made of hollowed-out wax, heavily blackened with soot to look exactly like lead. When the marabout loaded the gun, he was loading the wax dummy. The real, marked bullet was secretly palmed in Robert Houdin's hand, and during the distraction of the staging, he slipped it quietly into his own mouth. When the pistol fired, the intense heat of the gunpowder instantly vaporized the wax dummy into nothing but smoke. Nothing came out of the barrel at all. It was an illusion of absolute, terrifying perfection. The aftermath of this single performance altered the course of history. The tribal chieftains were so profoundly shaken by what they had witnessed that they abandoned the rebellion completely. They presented Robert Houdin with a beautifully illuminated manuscript praising his supreme and terrifying power, and signed a lasting peace treaty with the French Empire. Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin packed up his wooden boxes, boarded a ship, and quietly returned to his clocks in Paris, having prevented a massive war without spilling a single drop of blood. We remember him today not just as the father of modern magic, but as the man who understood the deepest, most dangerous secret of human nature. He proved that reality is entirely subjective. You don't need a massive army to conquer a nation, and you don't need magic to perform a miracle. All you need is absolute control over what people believe to be true. Because in the end, a fake bullet in the teeth is much more powerful than a real bullet in a gun.